Picture for a moment the Middle Ages not as a time of darkness and decay, but as an era of breathtaking imagination, a period when some of the most brilliant minds turned away from the battlefield and the forge to explore the very nature of reality itself. We often think of medieval innovation in terms of castles, catapults, and plows, but there exists a hidden history of devices so visionary, so intellectually daring, that they were designed not to conquer land or till soil, but to conquer ignorance and till the fertile ground of human thought. These were machines of the mind, crafted to give shape to questions that had no easy answers, to make the invisible visible, and to turn philosophy into something you could almost touch. Today, we're setting out on a journey to uncover 24 of these extraordinary creations, medieval devices, conceived not for war or labor, but for pure intellectual exploration. From intricate models of the heavens that let scholars simulate the motion of planets, to moral labyrinths where every path represented an ethical choice, these tools transformed abstract concepts into tangible experiences. They were built to ponder existence, to challenge dogma, to play with ideas about fate, free will, and the fabric of the cosmos. In a world often remembered for its strife, these artifacts remind us that the human spirit has always reached for understanding, for meaning, for wonder. What you're about to discover goes far beyond mere history. It's an invitation to see the past with new eyes and to reconnect with a timeless human urge to use creativity in the service of curiosity. Together, we'll explore celestial spheres, logic engines, allegorical clocks, and memory theaters, each one a testament to how medieval thinkers blended art, science, and philosophy to expand what was possible to imagine and therefore to know. This is a story about how ideas take form, how curiosity builds bridges between the abstract and the real, and how some of the most powerful machines ever built were made not of iron, but of insight. So settle in, open your mind, and let's step into a world where the greatest inventions were designed not to change the landscape, but to change the way we see it. It's a common misconception that the Middle Ages were a dark interlude in human history, a long, bleak pause between the brilliance of antiquity and the spark of the Renaissance. But this image of a stagnant, ignorant era couldn't be more wrong. In reality, this was a time of profound intellectual ferment, a period buzzing with curiosity and debate. Across Europe, from the quiet scriptoriums of remote monasteries to the bustling lecture halls of newly founded universities, scholars were passionately engaged with the biggest questions of existence. They weren't just preserving old knowledge, they were actively creating new frameworks for understanding the world. This vibrant culture of inquiry was made possible by unique institutions that served as engines of thought. Monasteries were not just places of prayer, they were the data centers of their day, where monks meticulously copied and commented on ancient texts, ensuring that the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other giants were not lost. Then came the universities, which began to spring up in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford from the 12th century onward. These were not yet the sprawling campuses we know today, but they were revolutionary communities of learning where masters and students gathered to dispute, discuss, and push the boundaries of knowledge in law, medicine, theology, and the arts. And let's not forget the royal and noble courts, where patrons with both wealth and curiosity supported thinkers and inventors, funding projects that blended art, science, and philosophy. What truly fueled this intellectual explosion was an unprecedented exchange of ideas across cultures and continents. Medieval Europe was far from an isolated backwater. It was connected to a wider world of knowledge through trade routes, diplomatic missions, and sometimes conflict. Scholars had access to a rich tapestry of thought, weaving together traditions from ancient Greece, the Islamic world, and Jewish philosophy. The works of Arab thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes were translated into Latin and became central to university curricula, introducing complex concepts in medicine, astronomy, and metaphysics. This wasn't a simple borrowing of ideas, it was a dynamic dialogue. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars in places like Spain and Sicily debated, refined, and built upon this shared heritage, creating a genuinely cosmopolitan intellectual culture. At the heart of this activity was a fascinating tension, a creative dialogue between faith and reason. The medieval mindset did not see these as opposing forces. Instead, thinkers believed that since both the natural world and sacred scripture were creations of God, they ultimately had to be in harmony. This belief drove them to use logic, observation, and rational argument to explore divine mysteries. They asked questions like, how can we understand the nature of free will within a universe governed by a divine plan? What is the structure of the cosmos, and what does it tell us about its creator? It was from this fertile ground, this desire to make the invisible visible and the abstract tangible, that our thought experiment devices were born. They were physical answers to philosophical questions, tools built not for plowing fields or besieging walls, but for plowing the depths of human understanding and besieging the fortress of the unknown. So what exactly were these thought experiment devices, and how did they differ from the practical tools we typically associate with the medieval world? Imagine a sword, a plow, or a catapult, each designed with a clear physical purpose: to cut, to till, to strike. Now picture something entirely different. These were objects crafted not to alter the material world, but to reshape how we think about it. They were built to simulate scenarios that couldn't be safely or ethically performed in reality, to test philosophical hypotheses, and to give concrete form to principles that were otherwise locked away in the realm of pure abstraction. They served as intellectual sandboxes, safe spaces where scholars could ask the most daring what-if questions without any real-world consequences. What if the stars moved in this pattern instead of that one? What if a person faced this exact moral dilemma? What if you could see the logical structure of an argument laid out like clockwork? These devices made those questions not just askable but explorable. Their forms were as varied as the questions they sought to answer. Some were breathtakingly intricate mechanical models of the cosmos, with brass rings and moving spheres that a scholar could manipulate to visualize planetary motion. Others were more like allegorical puzzles or intricate diagrams, a labyrinth etched into stone representing the twists and turns of ethical decision-making, or a beautifully illustrated wheel depicting the relentless turn of fortune's favor. They might represent virtues and vices as weights on a scale, or model the human body as a miniature universe to ponder the connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. This was where art, science, and philosophy didn't just meet, they fused into something new. The craftsman's skill gave physical beauty to the scholar's idea, and the philosopher's insight gave profound meaning to the artist's creation. This act of translation, of turning a thought into a thing, was perhaps their most revolutionary quality. In an age before widespread literacy or complex data visualization, these devices made the intangible tangible. A complex theological debate about free will could become a set of interlocking gears. A metaphysical concept about the harmony of the spheres could become a musical instrument. By making ideas visual, tactile, and interactive, they transformed passive learning into active engagement. A student didn't just hear a lecture on logic, they could turn the dials of a logic machine and watch a valid conclusion click into place. This didn't just make learning easier, It made it deeper and more memorable, engaging multiple senses to build a stronger understanding. In doing so, these medieval innovators demonstrated a remarkably sophisticated concept, that tools could be built to extend the mind itself, not just the body. We're familiar with technology that amplifies our physical strength or speed, but this was technology designed to amplify our cognitive capacities, to help us reason, to visualize, to remember, and to imagine on a grander scale. They were building the first prototypes for what we might now call cognitive tools, paving a conceptual path that would much later lead to everything from the scientific method, which relies on thought experiments, to modern simulation software and virtual reality. These devices stand as a powerful testament to the enduring human desire to not only navigate the world as it is, but to build new tools to explore all the worlds that could be. Among the most breathtaking of these intellectual tools was the celestial sphere model. Picture a beautifully intricate construction of polished brass or finely carved wood, a series of nested rings and circles that could be rotated by hand. This was no simple ornament, it was a working model of the universe as medieval scholars understood it. Each ring represented the path of a celestial body, the moon, the sun, the known planets, all set within the encompassing sphere of the fixed stars. A scholar could stand before it, gently turning these rings to simulate the complex dance of the heavens over hours, days, or even years. But the purpose here was far more profound than mere prediction or navigation. This device was built for debate, for wonder, for confronting the biggest questions one could possibly ask. With this mechanical universe in their hands, philosophers and astronomers could stage thought experiments that were otherwise impossible. They could ask, what if the motions were slightly different? What would that imply about the nature of the divine creator? By physically manipulating the model, they could visualize the consequences of different cosmological theories. These discussions often centered on the tension between determinism and free will. If the heavens moved in such a perfect clockwork fashion, did that mean human lives were equally predetermined? Or was there a freedom within that order? The sphere made these abstract philosophical struggles tangible. A user could trace the inevitable path of a planet with their finger, all while debating whether their own life's path was equally fixed or if they possessed the power to choose a different course. Influential thinkers like Robert Grosseteste in England and Albertus Magnus in Germany didn't just use these devices, they wrote detailed treatises on their construction and their philosophical implications. Grosseteste, a pioneering bishop and scientist, saw the celestial sphere as a bridge between the physical world and the metaphysical one. He used it to teach that the same mathematical harmony governing the stars might also underpin moral and spiritual truths. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican friar known for his immense scholarship, employed such models to demonstrate the principles of Aristotle's physics, making complex ideas about crystalline spheres and prime movers accessible to his students. In their hands, the sphere was more than a teaching aid. It was a key for unlocking a deeper, unified understanding of everything from physics to theology. The true revolution of the celestial sphere was its power to make the cosmos debatable. It transformed the heavens from a distant, awe-inspiring mystery into a system that could be questioned, tested, and intellectually dismantled right there in a study or lecture hall. This shift in perspective from passive observation of the divine to active engagement with its mechanics was a crucial cultural and intellectual step. It fostered a mindset of inquiry that refused to accept things merely on authority. This willingness to model, to simulate, and to question the fundamental nature of reality laid the essential groundwork for the methods of inquiry that would, centuries later, blossom into the full-fledged scientific revolution. Now, imagine stepping away from the grand model of the cosmos and into a more intimate, yet equally profound space, a labyrinth. But this was no simple garden maze meant for leisurely strolls. This was the labyrinth of choice, a carefully constructed puzzle where every twist and turn was a lesson in philosophy, and every dead end held a mirror to the soul. Unlike a traditional maze designed to confuse and challenge purely for amusement, this device was a physical map of the human condition. Its paths were not made of hedges or stone to be merely navigated. They were built of ideas to be deeply contemplated. Teachers and theologians would guide students through its course, but the real journey was an internal one, a confrontation with the weight of one's own decisions played out step by symbolic step. The design was rich with intentional metaphor. Entering the labyrinth represented the beginning of a life's journey or the facing of a significant moral quandary. Each fork in the path posed a distinct ethical dilemma. One route might symbolize the choice between honesty and deceit, another between courage and cowardice, or generosity and greed. Choosing a path was an active commitment to following that line of reasoning to its natural conclusion, and the consequences were built into the very architecture. A wrong turn wouldn't just lead to a harmless cul-de-sac. It would lead to a terminal point marked by a symbolic representation of the outcome, a sculpture depicting ruin, a plaque quoting scripture on failure, or simply an impassable wall. This physical stop was a powerful, silent teacher. It forced the traveler to stop, to retrace their steps, and to reflect on the poor choice that led them there. The center of the labyrinth, in stark contrast, was not merely the goal but the symbol of achieved virtue or enlightenment, often marked by a bench for meditation, a calming fountain, or an inspiring inscription. This interactive experience transformed dusty theological debates about free will and sin into something visceral and immediate. A scholarly argument about whether humans are truly free to choose good over evil became a personal reality when you stood at a junction, your body physically having to move in one direction or the other. The device made it clear that choices are rarely simple and their outcomes are intricately connected. A decision made at one crossroads would determine which new set of choices and which new set of potential dead ends or open pathways would become available next. This was a masterclass in understanding consequence and the interconnected nature of our actions, illustrating how a single poor decision could limit one's future options, while a virtuous one could open up new avenues for growth. By walking the path, users weren't just learning about ethics, they were practicing it in a safe, consequence-free environment. It was a form of moral muscle memory. The frustration of hitting a dead end and the satisfaction of finding the true path created emotional anchors that made the lessons far more memorable than any lecture could. This hands-on engagement encouraged a deeper, more empathetic understanding of the complexity of human morality. It taught that the path to virtue is rarely a straight line, often requiring backtracking from mistakes and perseverance in the face of confusion. The labyrinth of choice stood as a beautiful, tangible reminder that the journey of life is a continuous series of decisions, each one shaping the traveler long before they ever reach the final destination. After navigating the moral complexities of the labyrinth, one might yearn for a tool to make sense of the unpredictable tides of life itself, and medieval thinkers had a profound answer for that. Enter the Wheel of Fortune, a deceptively simple device with a deeply sophisticated purpose. Imagine a large, vertical disc made of wood or metal, mounted so it could be spun by hand. Painted or carved upon its surface were figures representing humanity in all its stations: a king rising triumphantly at the top, a contented merchant on the side, and a wretched beggar falling into obscurity at the bottom. But this wasn't a static image. With a simple turn of the wrist, the entire order could be upended. The king could be sent tumbling down, while the beggar might begin an unexpected ascent. This was no child's toy. It was a philosophical engine, a physical manifestation of one of the most enduring meditations on the human condition. Its primary inspiration came from the writings of Boethius, a Roman philosopher whose work, The Consolation of Philosophy, became a cornerstone of medieval thought. Writing from prison while awaiting execution, Boethius crafted a powerful dialogue with Lady Philosophy, who taught him that the gifts of fortune, riches, power, fame were inherently fleeting and unreliable. True happiness, she argued, could not be found in these external circumstances, which fortune could bestow and whisk away on a whim, but only through an internal turn toward virtue, wisdom, and the divine. The wheel device took this profound lesson and made it visceral. By physically rotating the wheel and watching figures rise and fall, users weren't just hearing about the fickleness of fate. They were demonstrating it with their own hands, internalizing the lesson that no position in life is permanent. This tool found its home in two seemingly opposite environments: the quiet solitude of monastic cells and the bustling intrigue of royal courts. In monasteries, monks used it for personal meditation, a focal point for contemplating the vanity of worldly ambitions and the importance of cultivating a soul that remains steadfast regardless of life's ups and downs. In the courts, it served a more public and perhaps more urgently needed purpose. Advisors might use it to counsel a proud king, gently reminding him that power is temporary and that humility in success is the mark of true wisdom. Conversely, it could offer hope to a courtier who had fallen from grace, visually arguing that their current low point was merely part of a cycle, not a final judgment. In both settings, the wheel sparked essential conversations about resilience, about how to endure adversity without breaking, and how to enjoy prosperity without becoming arrogant. The genius of the Wheel of Fortune was its ability to externalize an internal struggle. It gave form to the abstract anxiety that success might not last and the crushing fear that failure might be permanent. By turning the wheel and seeing the cycle complete itself over and over, a user could achieve a kind of philosophical detachment, a calming perspective that their current moment of joy or sorrow was just one phase in a larger turning pattern. This wasn't about encouraging passivity or a belief in pure luck. Rather, it was about redirecting effort away from the futile attempt to control external events and toward the achievable goal of mastering one's own internal response. The device taught that while we cannot stop the wheel from turning, we can absolutely choose what we cling to for stability as it spins, and the only thing truly worth clinging to is the unshakable character we build within ourselves. While the Wheel of Fortune dealt with the unpredictable currents of human life, another device sought to map the seemingly perfect and unchanging rhythms of the heavens, only to reveal even deeper philosophical puzzles. The Armillary sphere stands as one of the most elegant and intellectually rich instruments ever conceived. At first glance, it appears as a beautiful sculpture of metalwork, a series of exquisitely crafted rings nested within one another, all centered on a globe representing the Earth. But to a medieval scholar, this was far more than a decorative object or even a simple astronomical tool. It was a dynamic model of the entire cosmos, a machine for testing ideas about the very fabric of reality. By manually rotating these rings, which represented the celestial equator, the ecliptic path of the sun, and the orbits of planets, a user could physically simulate the complex motions of the heavens, predicting eclipses or tracking planetary positions. Yet its true purpose extended far beyond mere calculation into the realm of profound contemplation. This intricate device became a central prop in one of the era's most heated debates, the distinction between the celestial and the terrestrial, the perfect and the imperfect. Thinkers like the influential 13th century scholar Johannes de Sacrobosco, whose treatise on the sphere was a standard university text for centuries, used the Armillary sphere to illustrate a fundamental medieval worldview. He would point to the smooth, polished rings, turning with a precise and unwavering motion, and declare this as evidence of the perfection and immutability of the heavens, a realm made of a special, incorruptible fifth element called ether. Then he would gesture to the solid, stationary earth at the center, a sphere of the four base elements subject to constant change, decay, and chaos. The Armillary sphere made this philosophical dichotomy stunningly clear. The heavens were orderly, predictable, and divine. The earth was messy, unpredictable, and mortal. This wasn't just a scientific observation. It was a metaphysical statement about the entire structure of creation. But the device didn't just reinforce dogma. It also opened the door to daring questions about the limits of human understanding. As a scholar traced the path of a planet along its ring, they might ponder the mechanisms behind the motion. Was each ring moved by an intelligent celestial being, an angelic guide as some theologians proposed, or were the heavens governed by impersonal physical laws established by a divine creator? The sphere allowed them to test these theories visually, to see if a proposed celestial arrangement could account for the observed motions without violating philosophical principles. It fostered deep conversations about divine providence. If the cosmos was this orderly, what did that say about the mind that designed it? The very act of building and using such a precise instrument suggested that the human mind, despite being rooted in the imperfect earth, could nonetheless perceive and even replicate the majestic order of the heavens. This was a profoundly hopeful idea, that through reason and observation, humanity could bridge the gap between the fallen world and the divine perfection above. In this way, the Armillary sphere became a perfect symbol of the medieval intellectual spirit, a beautiful fusion of science, art, and philosophy. It was a tool that made the grandest cosmic ideas not only visible but manipulable, transforming abstract speculation into hands-on exploration. It encouraged scholars to see the universe as a coherent, interconnected whole, where physical laws and metaphysical truths were woven together into a single, harmonious tapestry. By turning the cosmos into a conversation you could hold in your hands, the Armillary sphere didn't just teach people about the stars. It taught them how to think about their place within a vast, ordered, and awe-inspiring universe. If the Wheel of Fortune taught the fickleness of worldly status, and the Armillary sphere revealed the perfect order of the heavens, then the allegorical clock confronted perhaps the most universal and pressing human concern, the relentless and irreversible passage of time itself. In an age before the constant, digital ticking of every device, the great clocks installed in cathedrals and town squares were not merely timekeepers. They were the beating heart of the community, and many were engineered to be its philosophical conscience as well. These were masterpieces of metallurgy and meaning, where every gear, bell, and animated figure served a dual purpose: to mark the hours and to meditate on what those hours truly mean for a mortal soul. They transformed the abstract, silent flow of time into a vivid, audible, and unforgettable moral drama. The visual language of these clocks was rich with symbolic intent. Instead of simple numbers, the dial might be encircled by the stages of human life, from the crawling infant to the stooped elder leaning on a staff. As the hour hand advanced, it pointed inexorably toward this final, frail figure. On the hour, the mechanism would whir into a deeper lesson. A door would spring open, and a procession of automated figures, known as a jacquemart, would enact a miniature play. A skeletal figure of death, often armed with a scythe or an hourglass, might emerge to strike the bell, a chilling reminder that each tolling hour was one step closer to the end. This grim specter could be followed by apostles, prophets, or personified virtues offering a counterpoint, a path to redemption through faith and good works. In some clocks, a figure of a king or a pope would be struck down by death at the appointed hour, a powerful democratic leveling that showed no earthly power could resist time's ultimate claim. These performances were not hidden away in scholarly studies. They were public spectacles designed for maximum impact. Installed in the very centers of community life, they spoke to everyone, the merchant rushing to the market, the noble riding through the square, the farmer in town for provisions. With each dramatic chiming of the hour, daily life would pause. Heads would turn upward to watch the mechanical morality play unfold high on the clock tower. This shared moment of reflection served as a communal memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning, "remember you must die." But this remembrance wasn't meant to inspire morbid fear or paralyzing dread. Its purpose was exactly the opposite, to instill a profound sense of urgency and purpose. By being confronted with the certainty of death, viewers were compelled to evaluate the quality of their life. Was this day spent in idleness, in vice, or in pursuit of trivial ambitions? Or was it spent in meaningful work, in kindness to others, and in strengthening one's spirit? This transformed the very concept of time from a neutral resource into a sacred responsibility. Time was not just something to be spent or wasted. It was the raw material of one's eternal destiny. Every passing moment was an opportunity to choose virtue over vice, charity over greed, faith over despair. The allegorical clock made this ethical imperative tangible. It answered the question, what should I do with my time? Not with a list of tasks, but with a vision of ultimate consequence. It argued that a life well lived was not measured in years accumulated, but in spiritual depth achieved. The steady, mechanical ticking in the background of every day became a constant, gentle prompt to live intentionally, to act with compassion, and to remain aware that our most finite resource is also the one that shapes our infinite future. While the allegorical clock used the relentless march of time to prompt moral reflection, another medieval invention turned inward, harnessing the very architecture of the mind to contain and organize vast realms of knowledge. This was the memory theater, an extraordinary cognitive tool that transformed the act of remembering from rote repetition into a vibrant, imaginative journey. Picture a scholar standing before a detailed model of a familiar building, a grand cathedral, a classical theater, or even their own home. But this model wasn't for play. It was a meticulously designed mental library. Within this structure, every room, every corner, every statue on a plinth was assigned a specific meaning. A lion carved near the entrance might symbolize the courage of a biblical king, while a glowing lamp in an upstairs chamber could represent divine wisdom. To memorize a complex theological argument or a lengthy philosophical treatise, the scholar would simply take a mental walk through this personalized building, placing each idea or piece of information at a specific, vivid location. When it came time to recall the information, they would retrace their steps, retrieving each concept from its designated spot. This was more than a mnemonic trick. It was a sophisticated method for building a vast, reliable, and intuitively organized mental database. The technique, known as the method of loci or the art of memory, had ancient roots stretching back to Greek and Roman orators like Cicero, but it was during the Middle Ages that it was revived and refined to an astonishing degree, particularly for grappling with the dense and complex ideas of scholastic theology and philosophy. A towering figure like Thomas Aquinas didn't just use this method, he championed it, arguing that a strong memory was the foundational virtue of the intellect, the storehouse upon which all understanding and wisdom were built. For a theologian tasked with mastering thousands of pages of scripture, church doctrine, and classical philosophy, the memory theater was an indispensable tool. It allowed them to hold entire summers' massive, multi-volume works systematically outlining theological truths in their mind's eye, ready to be accessed and cross-referenced in debate or meditation at a moment's notice. This wasn't about empty memorization. It was about creating a deeply interconnected web of knowledge where the relationship between ideas was mapped onto physical space, making the logical structure of an argument as tangible as the floor plan of a house. What made these theaters so powerful was their ability to engage multiple senses and faculties simultaneously. Abstract concepts, which are slippery and difficult to hold onto, were translated into concrete, often bizarre, and emotionally charged images. To remember a complex point about divine grace, a scholar might imagine a torrent of golden honey pouring from a specific crack in the ceiling of their mental theater. The strangeness of the image, its sensory richness, the smell of the honey, the sound of the drip, the feel of its stickiness made it unforgettable. This process of encoding information into vivid mental pictures actively engaged creativity and imagination, turning the solitary work of study into a dynamic process of inner creation. The spatial element was equally crucial. By distributing information across a familiar landscape, the mind could offload the burden of remembering sequence and order onto the environment itself. The argument unfolded naturally as one moved from the entrance hall to the grand chamber to the secluded garden, with the physical journey providing the scaffolding for the logical one. In this way, the memory theater was far more than a medieval study aid. It was a profound exploration of the very architecture of human thought. It demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how our brains are wired to remember places and stories far more easily than we remember disjointed facts or abstract propositions. Medieval scholars were, in effect, building external models of their own internal cognitive processes, using physical space as a metaphor for mental space. This practice reveals a fascinating self-awareness about the mechanics of learning and understanding. It highlights their belief that knowledge wasn't just a list to be absorbed, but a world to be explored, a vast and beautifully ordered mansion that the mind could learn to navigate with confidence and grace. The memory theater stands as a testament to the medieval quest, not just to acquire knowledge, but to master the art of thinking itself, constructing elaborate palaces of thought where wisdom could take up permanent residence. Moving from the structured mental architecture of the memory theater, we encounter a device shrouded in far more mystery and symbolic power, the model of the Philosopher's Stone. Popular culture often reduces this concept to a magical rock that turns lead into gold, but for many serious medieval thinkers, the stone was never primarily about material wealth. Instead, they crafted intricate physical models of it, beautiful objects made of polished crystal, veined marble, or even gilded metal, often inscribed with alchemical symbols and astrological signs. These were not functional tools for a laboratory. They were three-dimensional diagrams of a philosophical idea, meticulously constructed to serve as a focal point for the most profound kind of contemplation. The true alchemy they sought to catalyze was not the transformation of base metals, but the transmutation of the human soul from a state of ignorance and impurity to one of enlightenment and perfection. The journey these models represented was mapped through a rich and complex symbolic language. A typical stone might be depicted not as a single object, but as a process, a series of nested cubes or spheres showing stages of refinement. The initial, rough-hewn state symbolized the unawakened soul, clouded by worldly desires and false perceptions. Subsequent layers, becoming progressively smoother and more luminous, represented the stages of spiritual purification, the arduous work of confronting one's flaws, seeking knowledge, and cultivating virtue. The final, perfect, and often brilliantly red or gold central core represented the ultimate goal, the achievement of wisdom, inner unity, and a harmonious connection with the divine order of the cosmos. By meditating on this physical object, tracing its symbols with a finger, and reflecting on each stage, a seeker was performing a guided exercise in self-examination and aspirational thinking. The model was a mirror, asking its user not how to get rich, but how to become wise. This approach was deeply influenced by a branch of thought known as speculative or philosophical alchemy, which stood in stark contrast to its more practical, operative counterpart. While some alchemists were indeed focused on chemical experiments in smoky workshops, the philosophical alchemist used the language and processes of chemistry as a grand metaphor for inner development. The famous alchemical motto, solve et coagula, meaning dissolve and coagulate, was interpreted as a spiritual directive. First, one must dissolve the ego, breaking down rigid beliefs and prideful attachments, and then one must coagulate or reconstitute the self around a new, purified center of wisdom and virtue. The furnace was the heat of focused meditation, the alembic was the mind itself, and the prized philosopher's stone was the realized, enlightened self. These beautifully crafted models made this entire abstract process tangible, giving the seeker a physical anchor for an intensely internal and intangible journey. In this light, these models become powerful examples of how medieval culture used material objects to navigate the deepest questions of existence. They exemplify a worldview that saw the physical and spiritual realms as deeply interconnected, where a stone could be more than a stone, it could be a map of the soul's potential. The time and skill invested in creating these objects from precious materials underscored the immense value placed on the inner transformation they represented. They were not cheap tokens but cherished guides, reminding the user that the quest for self-knowledge and spiritual perfection was the most noble and worthwhile pursuit, a treasure far exceeding any hoard of gold. These silent, intricate objects encouraged a lifelong conversation with oneself, serving as a constant reminder that the greatest discoveries are not found in distant lands, but within the uncharted territory of one's own being. From the personal introspection of the Philosopher's Stone, we now turn to a device designed for the most public and weighty of responsibilities, the exercise of power. In an age of absolute monarchy where a single ruler's whim could mean prosperity or famine for thousands, a pressing question emerged: how do you teach a king to be good? The answer was not found in a sword or a scepter, but in a remarkable intellectual tool known as the Mirror of Princes. As the name suggests, this was not a looking glass made of polished silver, but a conceptual device, a book, an intricate diagram, or a richly illustrated manuscript that functioned as a metaphorical mirror. Its purpose was to reflect back to a ruler not his physical likeness, but an image of his moral character and the true consequences of his reign. It was a guide to statecraft that argued the most essential tool of governance was not military might or vast wealth, but a well-examined conscience. These mirrors were elaborate works of political philosophy disguised as practical advice manuals. They wove together classical wisdom from Plato and Aristotle, lessons from Roman history, and Christian theology into a coherent vision of the ideal leader. A typical mirror might feature a central diagram of a tree, its roots representing the foundational virtues of a ruler like justice and prudence, and its branches symbolizing the flourishing kingdom that would grow from such a foundation. Other versions used the powerful allegory of the body politic, depicting the realm as a human figure where the king was the head, the clergy the soul, the knights the arms, and the peasants the feet. This wasn't just a quaint image, it was a sophisticated political theory made visual. It taught that every part of society was interdependent, and that an ailment in one part, a neglected peasantry, a corrupt clergy, would cause the entire body to sicken. By studying this diagram, a young prince could visualize his role not as a detached autocrat, but as an integral organ within a living, breathing whole whose health depended on his wise stewardship. Influential thinkers dedicated their lives to crafting these reflective tools. In the 12th century, John of Salisbury wrote his Polycraticus, a text often considered the first comprehensive mirror of princes in the medieval West. He boldly argued that a tyrant, a ruler who governs for his own selfish ends, was not a true king at all, but a disease upon the body politic that could justifiably be opposed. More than a century later, Giles of Rome produced his massively influential De Regimine Principum on the rule of princes, a work so esteemed it was translated into multiple languages and became standard reading for royalty across Europe. Giles structured his mirror as a detailed guide, covering everything from a prince's personal moral conduct and education to his management of the household and the waging of just war. These authors weren't merely flattering their patrons, they were engaging in serious philosophical discourse, using the mirror to debate the nature of legitimate authority, the social contract between ruler and ruled, and the practical meaning of justice. The true genius of the Mirror of Princes was its psychological approach to education. It didn't just list rules for a ruler to follow, it engaged in a form of guided self-reflection. It posed challenging questions. When you look in this mirror, do you see a leader who seeks counsel from the wise, or one who listens only to flatterers? Do you see your decisions bringing peace and prosperity to the farthest corners of your realm, or do they sow fear and discontent? By providing vivid allegories and historical examples of both good and bad rulers, contrasting the glorious reign of a King David with the miserable end of a tyrant, the device made abstract concepts like justice and tyranny painfully concrete. It encouraged a ruler to engage in a daily practice of moral accounting, to weigh his actions against the ideal reflected in the mirror and adjust his course accordingly. This practice cultivated a mindset of critical thinking about power itself, transforming governance from a simple exercise of will into a complex ethical discipline centered on duty, service, and the profound responsibility of guiding the common good toward its fullest expression. Now, let's shift from the grand political stage to the precise world of structured thought, where medieval scholars tackled a fundamental challenge. How do you teach the art of thinking itself? Their ingenious answer was the logic machine, a remarkable contraption that turned the abstract rules of reason into something you could see, touch, and manipulate. Picture a beautifully crafted wooden box, its face studded with a series of rotating dials, sliding levers, or perhaps a grid of movable tokens. This was no mere curiosity. It was a functional engine for the mind, designed to map the intricate pathways of logical argumentation. At its heart lay the principles of Aristotelian logic, the dominant framework for rational discourse, which these devices translated into a dynamic, interactive experience. Each dial might represent a categorical term in a syllogism, the classic, "All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal," while the levers governed the logical operators that connected them. By setting the dials to certain positions and sliding the levers, a user could physically trace the flow of an argument from its premises to its inevitable conclusion, watching the machine either validate the reasoning with a satisfying alignment or reveal a flaw by failing to connect. These machines found their primary home in the bustling lecture halls of medieval universities, where the rigorous study of logic or dialectic was a cornerstone of the curriculum. For a student grappling with dense philosophical texts, the leap from reading about logical forms to actually applying them correctly could be immense. A logic machine acted as the perfect bridge. A master could use it to demonstrate the structure of a valid syllogism, showing how the truth of the premises guaranteed the truth of the conclusion through a mechanical, almost mathematical certainty. More importantly, it was a powerful tool for exposing error. A student could construct a flawed argument, perhaps one that committed the fallacy of the undistributed middle, and physically see the machine refuse to cooperate. The levers wouldn't slide into place, the tokens wouldn't align, providing an immediate, unambiguous visual cue that their reasoning was unsound. This hands-on feedback was transformative, turning the often daunting process of learning logic from a passive exercise in memorization into an active, engaging game of intellectual discovery. The deeper brilliance of these devices lay in their embodiment of a radical idea, that clear thinking could be systematized and that the very patterns of valid thought might share a kinship with the mechanics of the physical world. By building a machine whose parts interacted according to the immutable rules of logic, medieval inventors were making a profound statement about the orderliness of reason itself. They were suggesting that the principles governing a valid argument were as reliable and predictable as the gears in a clockwork mechanism. This wasn't about reducing human thought to a mere automaton. It was about providing an external scaffold to support the innate human capacity for reason, which is so often clouded by bias, emotion, and haste. The logic machine served as a perfect, impartial referee in debates, forcing participants to structure their arguments with precision and clarity. It cultivated a disciplined mindset that valued coherence over rhetoric and evidence over assertion, skills that were just as essential for theological debate and legal argumentation as they were for pure philosophy. In this way, the medieval logic machine stands as a forgotten precursor to a vast array of modern tools designed to extend our cognitive capacities. Its spirit lives on in everything from the flowcharts and decision trees used in modern computer programming and business analysis to the very concept of computer logic gates, where electrical circuits make binary decisions based on predefined logical rules. These ancient educators understood that to master a skill, especially one as abstract as critical thinking, we often need to externalize it to build a model we can interact with. They used the engineering savvy of their time to create the first interactive learning aids, demonstrating a timeless pedagogical truth: we learn best by doing. The logic machine didn't just teach students what to think. It gave them a physical apparatus to practice how to think, building the mental muscles of analysis, deduction, and rational inquiry that would become the bedrock of the scientific revolution and the enlightened world that followed. Having charted the precise pathways of logic, we now turn to a device of breathtaking scope, one that sought to map nothing less than the entire architecture of existence. Imagine a magnificent, sprawling tree, its roots buried deep in the earth and its highest branches brushing the heavens. But this was no ordinary tree found in a forest. It was the cosmic tree, an elaborate diagram painstakingly drawn on vellum or constructed as an intricate three-dimensional model. Every part of this tree was heavy with symbolic meaning. Its roots represented the ultimate divine source of all creation, the hidden ground of being from which everything springs. The massive trunk symbolized the stable, ordering principles that structure the universe, while the countless branches and leaves represented the magnificent, teeming diversity of the material world: every rock, every plant, every animal, and every human being. This was a philosophical engine in arboreal form, a single image designed to contain the entirety of the known and unknown cosmos, from its most spiritual origins to its most physical manifestations. Scholars would gather around this powerful visual tool to grapple with some of the most profound questions it's possible to ask. The tree provided a stunningly clear framework for understanding the great chain of being, a central medieval concept that saw all of creation arranged in a hierarchical, interconnected order. At the very top, near the divine roots, were the purest spiritual entities like angels and celestial intelligences. As you moved up the trunk and into the branches, you encountered humanity, positioned as a crucial link between the spiritual and the physical realms. Further out were animals, then plants, and finally minerals and the elements themselves at the very tips of the branches. This wasn't just a static ranking, it was a dynamic map of relationship and influence. It prompted deep debates about ontology, the nature of being itself. What does it mean for something to be? Does a rock have the same kind of existence as an angel? The tree suggested a spectrum of being, where all things shared in existence but in profoundly different degrees of perfection and reality, all flowing from a single divine source. This device was revolutionary because it made the invisible architecture of the universe visually accessible and intellectually manageable. A complex philosophical argument about humanity's place in the grand scheme could be literally pointed to on the diagram. Were we closer to the angels, capable of reason and touching the divine, or were we weighed down by our physical bodies, forever tangled in the lower material branches? The tree allowed for layered interpretations. A theologian might use it to illustrate how grace flows down from God through the hierarchy to nourish all souls. A natural philosopher might use it to discuss the properties of minerals and plants, seeing their place on the tree as indicative of their essential qualities and medicinal potentials. It served as a common reference point that could bridge different disciplines, allowing a conversation about physics to seamlessly become a conversation about metaphysics. By providing a shared visual language, the cosmic tree facilitated a holistic understanding that saw science, philosophy, and theology not as separate fields, but as different branches of the same fundamental quest for truth. In this way, the cosmic tree stands as a monumental achievement of medieval synthesis. It represents a worldview that refused to compartmentalize knowledge, instead insisting on the fundamental unity of all things. It encouraged a perspective that saw the sacred in the scientific and the logical in the spiritual. To contemplate this tree was to engage in a form of intellectual meditation, to trace the connections from the leaf in your hand all the way back to the divine root from which it ultimately grew. It taught that to understand any single part of creation, one must understand its relationship to the whole. This magnificent diagram was more than a teaching aid. It was a profound statement that the universe, in all its dizzying complexity, is ultimately a coherent, ordered, and interconnected whole, and that the human mind, when guided by the right tools, is capable of grasping its beautiful, branching logic. Following the intricate logic machines that mapped the pathways of reason, we encounter a device that appealed not just to the mind, but to the very conscience, the virtue and vice scales. Picture a beautifully crafted balance scale, perhaps made of polished brass or finely carved wood, but one that would never be found in a marketplace. Instead of standardized weights for measuring grain or coin, its pans held a far more precious and elusive cargo, the invisible substance of human character. One pan might be filled with small, carved tokens representing virtues like honesty, courage, or compassion, while the other held the counterweights of vice, greed, deceit, or wrath. A student or scholar would be presented with a scenario, a moral dilemma, and their task was to literally weigh the options, placing the corresponding tokens on the scales to see which set of consequences would tip the balance. This was philosophy made physical, a hands-on workshop for the soul that transformed abstract ethical debates into a tangible, gripping experience of choice and consequence. The power of this device lay in its brilliant simplicity and its profound interactive nature. A teacher might pose a complex dilemma. Should a merchant facing ruin tell a lie to secure a loan and save his family from poverty? The student would then grapple with the choice not just in their mind but with their hands. Placing the heavy weight of deceit on one side would have an immediate visual impact, causing that pan to sink with a definitive clink. But then, what of the compassion for his family? Adding that virtue to the same pan might begin to level the scales, creating a tense equilibrium. Perhaps the virtue of justice for the lender being deceived must be considered, adding weight to the other side. The physical act of adding and removing these symbolic weights forced a slow, deliberate consideration of every factor. It made vividly clear that ethical decisions are rarely a simple matter of one overwhelming right against one obvious wrong. They are most often a delicate and agonizing balance of competing goods and lesser evils, where a single small factor can change the entire outcome. This process cultivated a nuanced understanding of morality, teaching that context matters and that the right action often requires careful measurement of all its potential effects. This fascination with balance was far more than a pedagogical preference. It was a reflection of a core medieval worldview that saw equilibrium as the fundamental principle of a harmonious existence, echoing from the human soul all the way out to the cosmos itself. The scales were a microcosm of this grand belief, just as the four humors in the body needed to be in balance for physical health, and just as the four classical elements of the universe sought a stable mixture, so too did the human soul require a careful balancing of its drives and dispositions. A virtue taken to an extreme could itself become a vice. Courage without prudence could become recklessness. Generosity without temperance could become profligacy. The scales taught the golden mean, the Aristotelian ideal that virtue is the midpoint between two deficient extremes. By physically manipulating the weights, users internalized the lesson that a good life is not about eliminating desires or passions, but about properly weighing and balancing them, bringing them into a harmonious proportion where no single aspect of one's character is allowed to dominate and destabilize the whole. This tool was a masterclass in self-regulation, providing a physical metaphor for the internal, ongoing work of ethical self-correction that defines moral maturity. In this way, the virtue and vice scales did more than just teach ethics. They trained a crucial habit of mind. They encouraged a pause, a moment of reflection before action, inviting the user to step back and weigh the full moral weight of a decision. This practice of deliberate moral accounting was seen as essential for anyone, from a future theologian to a humble craftsman, aiming to navigate the complexities of life with wisdom and integrity. The final click of the balance beam settling into place offered no easy answers, but rather a visual representation of a considered judgment, a snapshot of a soul in deliberation. It stood as a powerful, silent reminder that our choices have weight, that they tip the balance of our character and our community, and that the pursuit of a good life is a constant, careful, and beautiful act of balancing. Yet, even as these beautifully crafted scales weighed the moral choices of an individual life, another device invited its user to look upward, to contemplate the vast celestial machinery that might itself be weighing the fate of humanity. Enter the Contemplation Astrolabe, an instrument that masterfully bridged the gap between precise calculation and profound philosophical wonder. In its most common form, the astrolabe was a sophisticated calculating engine, a flat, circular disc of brass, intricately etched with a map of the heavens for a specific latitude. By sighting a star through its central alidade or rule and rotating its movable parts, a skilled user could tell the time, calculate the sun's altitude, or predict the rising of constellations. It was, in essence, a handheld analog computer for navigating the physical world, but a specific category of these devices was crafted for a far different kind of journey. These contemplation astrolabes were lavishly decorated not just with functional markings, but with poetic inscriptions from scripture or classical philosophy, intricate engravings of zodiacal symbols, and allegorical scenes. They were less tools for the hand and more gateways for the mind, designed to turn a practical act of measurement into a moment of deep meditation on humanity's place within a grand and ordered cosmos. Holding such an object, a scholar would engage in a dual-layered practice. The first layer was the technical one, aligning the retere or star chart with the mater or base plate to solve a specific astronomical problem. But the second layer, prompted by the beautiful decorations, was contemplative. As their fingers traced the engraved paths of the planets, they might ponder whether those paths represented an unbreakable chain of destiny or simply a beautiful pattern set in motion by a creator who also granted free will. An inscription around the edge, perhaps a quote from the Psalms like, "The heavens declare the glory of God," would pull their thoughts from the mechanical function toward the metaphysical. The device became a prompt to ask if the mathematical regularity of the stars was a reflection of a deeper, moral order in the universe, and if understanding the former could lead to wisdom about the latter. It encouraged a form of thinking where scientific observation and spiritual reflection were not in conflict, but were two complementary ways of reading the same divine text, one written in the language of mathematics, the other in the language of symbol and soul. This practice of using the heavens as a mirror for inner exploration was a powerful medieval concept. The Contemplation Astrolabe made this metaphor literal. As the user held the polished brass disc, they would see their own faint reflection superimposed upon the engraved map of the stars. This was a deliberate and stunning visual allegory. It placed the human individual directly within the cosmic order, suggesting an intimate connection between the microcosm of the self and the macrocosm of the universe. Gazing at this reflection, a scholar wasn't just calculating the position of Venus. They were contemplating the nature of love and beauty. They weren't just tracking the sun's path. They were reflecting on the light of divine wisdom, illuminating their own understanding. The device framed the entire cosmos as a vast, reflective surface meant for self-discovery, proposing that by studying the harmonious motions above, we might better understand how to bring harmony to the turbulent world within our own hearts and minds. This elegant fusion of utility and introspection perfectly encapsulates a defining characteristic of medieval intellectual life: the refusal to erect hard barriers between different ways of knowing. The Contemplation Astrolabe was not a tool that had its practical function and then its decorative philosophy added on as an afterthought. The two were conceived as an inseparable whole, each giving deeper meaning to the other. The precision of its astronomical markings gave credibility to the spiritual insights it prompted, suggesting that these were not mere superstitions but reflections based on observable reality. Conversely, the philosophical inscriptions elevated the act of calculation from a mundane task to a sacred one, a participation in the divine act of measuring and ordering creation. It was a device built for the whole person, for the rational mind that seeks patterns and the contemplative spirit that seeks meaning, demonstrating that the most profound discoveries occur not when we choose between science and spirituality, but when we find the tools that allow them to speak to one another in a continuous, enlightening conversation. While the Contemplation Astrolabe used the stars to mirror the soul, Another remarkable medieval device turned its gaze entirely inward to the mysterious landscape of the sleeping mind. The dream interpretation wheel was a sophisticated tool that transformed the chaotic jumble of nightly visions into a structured field of philosophical inquiry. Picture a large, circular diagram, beautifully illustrated on parchment or crafted as a rotating disc of wood or metal. Its surface was divided into segments, much like a pie chart of the subconscious, with each section corresponding to a different category of dream imagery or theme. Around its circumference, you might find symbols for common dream elements: a soaring eagle, a rushing river, a crumbling tower, a crown, each one meticulously linked through radiating lines to various interpretive meanings. This was not a simple fortune-telling gadget. It was a complex cognitive map designed to bring order to the most disordered realm of human experience and to ask a daring question. What if our dreams are not just nonsense, but a form of data about ourselves and the universe? Medieval scholars who used this wheel were engaging with a formal discipline known as oneirology, the study of dreams, which had a rich pedigree stretching back to ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic traditions. But their approach was far from the superstitious decoding we might imagine. For them, the wheel was a framework for a rigorous, almost scientific analysis. A scholar would recall a dream upon waking and then turn to the wheel, not to get a single definitive meaning, but to explore a range of possible interpretations. The symbol of a dog, for instance, might be connected on the wheel to meanings as diverse as loyalty if the dog was friendly, betrayal if it was aggressive, or illness based on ancient humoral theory connecting animals to bodily fluids. The user's task was to weigh these possibilities against the specific context of the dream and their own waking life, engaging in a deliberate process of cross-referencing and critical thinking. This practice turned dream interpretation from a passive acceptance of a predetermined omen into an active, intellectual exercise in pattern recognition and self-reflection. The deepest debates this tool fostered were not about predicting the future, but about grappling with the very nature of reality and perception. By systematically categorizing dreams, scholars were forced to confront fundamental questions. Where do these vivid narratives come from? Are they merely fragments of the day's events, scrambled by a resting brain, a theory some medieval thinkers advanced based on Greco-Arabic medicine? Could they be messages from a divine or angelic source, a form of communication that bypasses the waking senses? Or were they perhaps productions of the dreamer's own soul, offering symbolic insights into their inner state, hidden desires, or spiritual health? The dream interpretation wheel provided a neutral ground for these debates. It allowed a user to apply different interpretive lenses, psychological, physiological, theological, to the same set of dream symbols, comparing the results and evaluating which framework offered the most coherent explanation. This encouraged a remarkably modern and multifaceted understanding of the mind, acknowledging that a single phenomenon could be examined from multiple valid angles. In this way, the wheel was far more than a curiosity. It was a testament to the medieval conviction that the inner world of consciousness was every bit as real and worthy of systematic study as the outer world of planets and plants. It reflected a belief that the human being was a microcosm, and that therefore the strange, symbolic language of dreams might hold clues to universal truths, just as the movement of the stars did. By creating a tool to navigate this inner space, medieval thinkers demonstrated a profound respect for the complexity of the human psyche. They acknowledged that understanding ourselves requires not just looking outward through an astrolabe, but also inward through the disciplined, yet imaginative, interpretation of the stories we tell ourselves in the dark. If the dream interpretation wheel charted the mysterious inner world of the subconscious, the Microcosm-Macrocosm model performed a similar feat for the entire physical self, positioning the human body as the most profound and intimate map of the universe ever created. This was not a single, standardized device but a powerful conceptual model, expressed in breathtakingly detailed anatomical illustrations in manuscripts or even as intricate three-dimensional figures crafted from wood or metal. These representations depicted the human form often in a classic spread eagle pose, but superimposed upon it was a vast web of connections, a celestial cartography that mapped the stars, planets, and elements directly onto the organs, limbs, and humors of the body. The liver might be governed by Jupiter, the heart by the Sun, the spleen by Saturn. The four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were directly linked to the four classical elements of air, water, earth, and fire. This was far more than a fanciful analogy. It was a sophisticated philosophical framework that proposed an audacious and beautiful idea: that to truly understand the vast, impersonal cosmos, one must first learn to read the intricate universe within. This model was built upon the ancient principle of as above, so below, a concept of correspondence that saw the entire created order as a series of mirrors reflecting the same essential patterns at different scales. The medieval mind, steeped in this holistic worldview, saw these connections not as poetic metaphors but as literal, operational truths. The macrocosm was the great, ordered universe, the cosmos itself with its revolving spheres and harmonious motions. The microcosm was the human being, a miniature replica containing all the same components and forces, just in a more condensed and concentrated form. This meant that every internal process had an external counterpart. A fever wasn't just an illness, it was a personal, internal fire echoing the elemental fire of the cosmos. A period of melancholy wasn't just a mood, it was an excess of earthly black bile, a microcosmic reflection of the cold, dry influence of the planet Saturn. The body became a living, breathing astrological chart, constantly interacting with and responding to the movements of the celestial bodies above. This framework provided a common language that seamlessly wove together disciplines we now consider entirely separate. In medicine, a physician would use this model to diagnose and treat illness. An affliction of the brain might be linked to the moon, which governed moisture and changeability, suggesting treatments that sought to dry and stabilize the body's internal climate. This was a form of systems thinking, recognizing that an imbalance in one part of the microcosm, be it an element, a humor, or a planetary influence, would inevitably ripple through the whole. In spirituality, the model offered a path to divine connection. Mystics and theologians argued that since the human soul was the pinnacle of the microcosm, fashioned in the image of God, the journey inward through self-knowledge and purification was simultaneously a journey upward toward understanding the mind of the Creator. By bringing their own internal universe into harmony, they believed they could resonate more perfectly with the divine harmony of the macrocosm. The profound power of the microcosm-macrocosm model was its ability to make the universe knowable and the self significant. In a world that could often feel vast, chaotic, and intimidating, this idea placed every individual at the very center of a coherent and meaningful existence. You were not a powerless speck in an indifferent universe. You were a focal point where all the forces of creation converged and could be consciously felt and managed. Your health, your emotions, your very spirit were active participants in a continuous cosmic dialogue. This model encouraged a deep and responsible form of self-awareness, a daily attentiveness to one's own internal state as a way of monitoring one's relationship with the entire cosmos. It taught that personal well-being and cosmic order were two sides of the same coin, and that the quest for a healthy, virtuous life was the most practical way any individual could contribute to the harmony of the great, magnificent whole. After exploring the intimate connection between the human body and the cosmos, we arrive at a device designed to train the very mind that sought to understand such profound connections, the theological debate engine. Imagine walking into a medieval university classroom and seeing not just books and lecterns, but a complex wooden contraption sitting at the front of the room, bristling with levers, dials, and slots for movable tokens. This was no toy or mere curiosity. It was a sophisticated training simulator for the mind, built to turn the dizzying abstractions of theological argument into a tangible, almost mechanical process. In an era where theological debate was the highest form of intellectual sport, mastering the intricate rules of logic and dialectic was essential. This engine provided a hands-on way to practice, allowing students to physically construct and deconstruct complex arguments, seeing the anatomy of reason laid bare before their eyes in a way that parchment and lecture alone could never achieve. The design of these engines was a masterpiece of pedagogical ingenuity, translating the abstract structure of a logical argument into a visual and tactile experience. A typical device might feature a series of levers representing major premises, the foundational statements upon which an argument is built. Sliding these levers into different positions would engage various gears or change the available pathways for a set of tokens, which themselves symbolized the minor premises and potential conclusions. A student could, for instance, set a lever to the position for "all men are mortal" and another for "Socrates is a man." Then, by pushing a token labeled Socrates through the correct slot, they would watch it travel along a track and definitively land in a bin labeled "therefore mortal." This physical causation mirrored the logical causation of a valid syllogism. The real learning happened when the machine refused to cooperate. If a student tried to force an invalid conclusion, the token would jam, the gears would grind to a halt, or the pathway would simply be blocked, providing an immediate, unambiguous signal that their reasoning was flawed. This instant feedback was revolutionary, transforming the often dry and difficult study of logic into an interactive and deeply engaging puzzle. This approach reveals a profound commitment to active, participatory learning that stands in stark contrast to the modern stereotype of medieval education as a place of dull rote memorization. Medieval educators understood that true mastery of a subject like theology, with its life and death stakes for the soul, required more than just passively absorbing information. It demanded the ability to actively wield ideas, to defend them against attack, and to identify weaknesses in opposing views. The debate engine was the ultimate tool for cultivating this intellectual discipline. It forced students to slow down and think step by step, making the invisible process of reasoning visible and manageable. By externalizing the structure of argument, it allowed them to see logical fallacies like circular reasoning or false dilemmas, not as vague concepts, but as tangible malfunctions in the machine's operation. This hands-on practice built a kind of muscle memory for sound thinking, training a generation of scholars to pursue truth with both passion and precision, ensuring their faith was built upon the unshakable foundation of rigorous thought. Leaving behind the structured logic of the debate engine, we now set sail on a far more personal and perilous voyage, guided by one of the most enduring and powerful metaphors of the medieval mind, the allegorical ship. Picture a beautifully illuminated page in a manuscript or an intricately carved model displayed in a church, depicting not a vessel for trade or war, but a ship navigating a symbolic sea. This was no mere decoration. It was a sophisticated spiritual compass, a device designed to help every individual chart the course of their own soul through the turbulent waters of earthly existence. The ship itself represented the human person, or sometimes the collective community of believers, undertaking the most important journey imaginable, the passage from the shores of birth toward the distant, hoped-for harbor of eternal salvation. Every single element of this scene was charged with meaning, transforming a simple image into a dynamic tool for profound self-examination and moral navigation. The genius of this device lay in its rich and universally understandable symbolism, which preachers and teachers would unpack to make complex theological ideas instantly graspable. The sea represented the world itself, vast, unpredictable, and filled with both wonder and danger. The storms that frequently lashed the ship's sails were the inevitable trials of life, temptation, doubt, grief, and persecution. The rocky coastlines and hidden shoals symbolized the ever-present risks of moral failure and sin, which could wreck the soul if not carefully avoided. The ship's rudder stood for free will, the human capacity to steer a chosen course, while its mast and sails represented faith, catching the wind of divine grace to propel the journey forward. And on the horizon, bathed in a welcoming light, was the safe harbor, the ultimate destination of peace and union with the divine. This comprehensive visual language allowed even those who could not read to understand the spiritual challenges of life as a navigational problem, requiring skill, vigilance, and trust. Engaging with this allegory was an active, participatory process. A person might meditate on the model or illustration, mentally placing themselves aboard the ship. They would be encouraged to ask themselves pointed, reflective questions. What kind of captain am I being of my own soul? Is my rudder of free will firmly gripped, or am I allowing myself to be tossed by the storms of passion and circumstance? Are my sails of faith patched and strong, ready to receive grace, or are they in tatters? Have I drifted toward the dangerous rocks of greed, pride, or despair? This practice transformed abstract concepts of virtue and vice into tangible obstacles and tools on a relatable journey. It made the stakes of daily choices vividly clear. A moment of anger wasn't just a bad mood, it was a squall threatening to blow the ship off course. An act of charity wasn't just a good deed, it was a necessary correction of the tiller, steering back toward the true north of one's ultimate purpose. This powerful tool served as a relentless reminder that resilience and perseverance were not optional, but essential skills for the voyage. The allegory acknowledged that storms were inevitable. No one could expect a completely calm sea. The goal was not to avoid challenges, but to learn how to navigate through them without sinking. The ship was always depicted as sturdy and capable, implying that every human soul was equipped by its creator to withstand the tempests, provided it used its God-given tools correctly. This offered profound comfort and hope. A person in the midst of suffering could look at the allegorical ship and understand their hardship not as a meaningless punishment, but as a difficult but navigable stretch of water on a longer journey toward a guaranteed safe haven. It taught that spiritual safety was not found in avoiding the ocean, but in becoming a better, more faithful sailor, learning to read the signs of the stars above and the currents below, and always keeping the distant harbor fixed in the heart's eye as the unwavering destination. Now let's turn our attention to a device that placed humanity directly at the crossroads of cosmic influence and personal choice, the Zodiac man figure. Imagine a detailed anatomical drawing or a carefully sculpted model of a human form, but superimposed over it, mapped onto each limb and organ, were the 12 signs of the Zodiac. Aries the ram might govern the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces presiding over the feet. At first glance, this might appear to be a simple medical chart, a guide for bloodletting or administering treatments according to the stars' positions. But to dismiss it as mere superstitious medicine would be to miss its far deeper, more fascinating purpose. This figure was less a diagnostic manual and more a philosophical battlefield, a central tool in one of the era's most intense debates. Are we merely puppets of celestial forces, or do we possess the power to shape our own destiny through our actions and character? Medieval scholars would gather around this vivid illustration to wrestle with the complex interplay between astrology and free will. On one side of the debate were those who saw a deterministic universe, where the motions of the planets and stars exerted a direct, unchangeable influence on the humors of the body and the passions of the soul. From this perspective, a person born under the melancholic influence of Saturn might be naturally inclined toward sadness and introspection, while someone under the bold sway of Mars could have a fiery, combative temperament. The Zodiac man figure gave this view a powerful visual language. It made the cosmic connection seem tangible and physically immediate. Yet there was a powerful counter-argument, championed by theologians and philosophers who insisted that divine gift of reason and the cultivated habit of virtue could resist these celestial inclinations. They used the very same diagram to argue a more nuanced point, that while the stars might incline, they do not compel. The figure didn't just show fate, it illustrated a starting point, a set of innate challenges and strengths that each individual was tasked with managing through moral effort and intellectual discipline. This turned the Zodiac man into a dynamic tool for teaching ethical responsibility. A teacher could point to the part of the body governed by, say, passionate Scorpio and acknowledge the natural intensity it might impart. But then the lesson would pivot to how that raw energy could be mastered and redirected, channeled into steadfast loyalty instead of jealousy, or into profound emotional depth rather than secretive manipulation. The device fostered a sophisticated form of self-awareness, encouraging individuals to understand their innate tendencies not as a fixed sentence, but as the raw material of their character, to be refined through conscious choice. It promoted the idea that true freedom wasn't the absence of influence, but the cultivated ability to choose one's response to it. This was a profoundly empowering message, suggesting that self-knowledge and moral effort could allow a person to effectively collaborate with the cosmos, using their astrological makeup as a guide for growth rather than an excuse for behavior. In this way, the Zodiac man figure stands as a brilliant symbol of the medieval drive to synthesize all knowledge into a unified whole. It refused to compartmentalize science, philosophy, and theology into separate boxes. Instead, it wove them together into a single, complex tapestry of understanding. It acknowledged the observations of astronomy and the patterns of the natural world, while simultaneously upholding the central importance of human freedom and ethical striving. This device didn't provide easy answers. It provided a framework for asking better questions about our place in a vast, interconnected universe. It represents a worldview that sought harmony between the external cosmos and the internal self, suggesting that to understand one, you must continually seek to understand the other. If the allegorical ship charted the soul's perilous journey and the Zodiac man mapped the cosmic influences on the body, the Wheel of Life offered a sweeping overview of the entire human journey from cradle to grave. This powerful device took the familiar circular form of the Wheel of Fortune but turned its gaze inward, mapping the universal arc of a single human existence onto its spinning surface. Imagine a large wooden wheel divided into 4 compelling segments, each vividly painted with a stage of life. One quadrant might show a mother cradling a newborn, representing the innocence and dependence of infancy. The next would depict a young knight practicing with a sword or a scholar with a book, bursting with the energy and potential of youth. Adulthood would be illustrated by a figure in their prime, perhaps a judge dispensing wisdom or a merchant overseeing his thriving business, embodying responsibility and power. And finally, the fourth segment would show an elderly man, frail and leaning on a staff, gazing toward a distant horizon, representing the quiet reflection and physical decline of old age. Often, each stage was accompanied by a symbolic animal, a lamb for infancy, a spirited horse for youth, a regal lion for adulthood, and a weary ox for old age, layering the image with even deeper meaning about the nature of each phase. This was not a static painting, it was a dynamic philosophical instrument. A viewer could physically spin the wheel, watching the stages cycle past in an endless, inevitable loop, a visceral demonstration that every life, regardless of station or wealth, was subject to the same inexorable progression of time. This rotating panorama was employed masterfully in both monastic and public settings as a catalyst for profound meditation. In the quiet of a monastery, a monk might sit before the wheel, using it as a focal point to contemplate his own path. Spinning it slowly, he would see the vigorous youth he once was give way to the mature adult he had become, and eventually to the elderly man he would one day be. This was not meant to inspire despair, but rather a clear-eyed, purposeful awareness of life's brevity. In parish churches, priests would use the wheel during sermons to make abstract teachings about mortality instantly graspable for their congregations. They could point to the figure of the powerful adult and remind the wealthy merchant in the front pew that his influence was temporary. They could gesture to the elderly man and offer comfort to those suffering the pains of aging, assuring them that this, too, was a natural and sacred part of a divinely ordained cycle. The wheel's constant motion made the concept of impermanence undeniably real, urging everyone to look beyond the immediate concerns of their current stage and consider the ultimate destination of their soul. In this way, the wheel of life functioned as one of the most powerful and widespread forms of Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning, "remember you must die." But its purpose was far more profound than simply inducing a fear of death. Its true aim was to inspire a richer, more meaningful engagement with life itself. By making the entirety of one's existence visually present all at once, the wheel argued that a life well lived was a continuous process of spiritual development. The energy of youth was to be harnessed and directed, not squandered. The power and influence of adulthood were to be used for justice and charity, not self-aggrandizement. The wisdom and perspective of old age were to be shared, not hoarded. The device taught that each stage held its unique virtues and potential pitfalls, and that spiritual growth was the thread that should connect them all, transforming a mere biological timeline into a coherent narrative of purpose. It asked a question that resonates through the centuries. If you could see your whole life laid out on this wheel, what would you change about the segment you're in right now? How would you steer the turning, while the labyrinth of choice guided users through the murky waters of moral consequence? A far more intricate and demanding structure awaited those seeking to train the very architecture of their thinking, the logic labyrinth. This was not a garden path designed for ethical reflection, but a formidable intellectual gauntlet, a three-dimensional puzzle where every corridor, dead end, and gateway represented a precise step in a logical argument or a deceptive trap of fallacious reasoning. Constructed from stone, hedge, or even laid out as an elaborate tiled floor, this labyrinth's challenges were not of virtue and vice, but of validity and contradiction. To enter was to accept that your own reasoning would be your only guide, and that a single misstep in logic could leave you hopelessly lost in a maze of your own flawed conclusions. The design of this labyrinth was a masterpiece of philosophical engineering. Each junction presented the wanderer with a fork, not between right and wrong, but between different logical operators or premises. One path might be marked with a symbol for if-then, another for and, or. Choosing a path was like selecting a rule of inference. A correct turn would lead to a new set of coherent possibilities, while a misstep, perhaps confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient one, would lead to a chamber representing a logical fallacy. Imagine arriving in a circular room with no exit, its walls inscribed with the famous liar's paradox. This statement is false, a tangible demonstration of how certain premises can lead to irresolvable contradictions that halt all progress. Other dead ends might illustrate common fallacies like the appeal to emotion or the false dilemma, each designed to be a frustrating but unforgettable lesson in poor reasoning. The only way out was to retrace one's steps, identify the precise point where the argument had broken down, and choose a different, more sound logical path. Medieval masters used this demanding environment to teach the rigorous art of dialectics, the formal method of debate based on logic and reason. A student wouldn't just read about the structure of a valid syllogism. They would have to physically enact it, moving from the major premise to the minor premise, and finally to the conclusion, with the architecture of the labyrinth itself confirming their correct path by opening into a new wing. This method made abstract, mind-bending concepts stunningly concrete. The idea of necessity became a single, narrow gate that had to be passed through to proceed. Contingency was represented by multiple possible routes, all of which could lead to a valid, if different, conclusion. Contradiction was a solid, impassable wall built from two opposing ideas that could not logically coexist. By navigating this physical space, students developed an intuitive, almost visceral understanding of how ideas fit together, learning to feel the jarring wrongness of a fallacy as surely as they felt the satisfying click of a valid deduction. This profound love for the puzzle reveals a central facet of the medieval intellectual spirit, the belief that grappling with difficulty was the surest path to wisdom. The logic labyrinth was not meant to be easy or immediately solvable. Its value lay in the struggle, the frustration of being lost, the careful backtracking, the moment of clarity when the pattern finally emerged. This entire process was seen as an essential discipline for the mind and the character. It cultivated intellectual humility, forcing the would-be logician to acknowledge their errors. It rewarded patience and meticulous attention to detail. And perhaps most importantly, it trained a form of cognitive resilience, the ability to hold complex, opposing ideas in the mind without panic, to test them methodically, and to find a coherent path forward through sheer force of reasoned thought. In this way, the labyrinth was more than a classroom. It was a gymnasium for the intellect, building the mental muscles needed to navigate a world filled with persuasive but flawed arguments, and to construct a foundation of thought that was truly sound and reliable. From the intricate pathways of the logic labyrinth, we now turn to a device that sought to map the very building blocks of reality itself, the sphere of elements. Picture a beautifully crafted model of the cosmos, not of planets and stars, but of fundamental principles. Imagine a series of transparent, concentric spheres, one nested inside the other like a celestial onion. At the very center, a solid sphere of Earth represented the heaviest, most stable element. Surrounding it was a layer of water, then one of air, and finally, encasing it all, a sphere of leaping, dancing flames representing fire, the lightest and most energetic of the four. This was not a static ornament, it was a dynamic philosophical instrument. Scholars would hold this model, often made of glass, metal, or even different colored liquids suspended in oil, and manipulate it to physically simulate the interactions they believed governed all of material existence. By tilting the sphere, they could watch the layers shift, observing how fire might rise through air or how earth would sink through water, turning abstract theory into a tangible, visual experiment. This elegant device was the centerpiece of deep debates in natural philosophy, serving as a three-dimensional textbook on the nature of change and stability. Medieval thinkers, drawing on ancient Greek ideas, believed that every substance in the world was a unique mixture of these four pure elements. The model allowed them to visualize this theory with stunning clarity. They could ask profound questions. What happens when wood burns? The sphere helped them see it not just as destruction, but as a process of transformation, the release of the elements of fire and air trapped within the earthy substance of the log. Why does water evaporate? It was the sphere of air acting upon the sphere of water, drawing it upward and transforming it into mist. This wasn't primitive science, it was a sophisticated attempt to find a unified theory of matter, a way to explain the dazzling diversity of the physical world through a simple, elegant, and interconnected system of fundamental components. The sphere of elements made the chaos of natural phenomena seem orderly, predictable, and ultimately understandable. At its heart, this device fueled a crucial philosophical struggle. Was the universe fundamentally orderly and governed by discernible laws, or was it a realm of chaos and unpredictable change? The very design of the sphere argued powerfully for order. Its perfect geometric shape and neatly layered rings presented a cosmos that was rational and structured. By manipulating it, scholars were essentially testing the rules of this cosmic game, probing the boundaries of how the elements should behave according to philosophical first principles. Yet, the model also acknowledged the reality of constant change and transformation. The very reason for its invention was to simulate it. This created a fascinating tension. The sphere suggested that beneath the apparent chaos of storms, growth, decay, and combustion, there lay a hidden, stable architecture of elemental relationships. The task of the natural philosopher was to uncover these immutable laws, to see through the flux of surface appearances to the permanent principles operating below. This drive to find harmony beneath disorder was a monumental leap in human thought, a precursor to the scientific search for natural laws that would emerge centuries later. This humble model, with its four simple layers, represents one of the most ambitious chapters in the medieval intellectual story. It showcases a culture that refused to see the physical world as a mere collection of disconnected wonders or as a backdrop for human drama. Instead, it was a puzzle to be solved, a text to be read, a complex system whose language was the interaction of earth, water, air, and fire. The scholars who pondered this sphere were engaging in a profound act of faith that the universe was intelligible, that the human mind was capable of grasping its workings, and that through a combination of careful observation and daring speculative thought, we could begin to decode the deepest secrets of nature. They were building the first conceptual bridges between the world of experience and the world of theory, demonstrating that the most profound truths about reality could often be found not in grand pronouncements, but in the thoughtful manipulation of a well-designed model. After navigating the structured arguments of the logic labyrinth, we arrive at a device designed not to find a single right answer, but to hold multiple competing truths in a dynamic, creative tension, the dialogue machine. Picture a large, table-sized contraption of wood and brass, its surface a complex array of rotating panels, sliding tabs, and interlocking gears. Each movable part is inscribed with a philosophical proposition or a foundational premise. One panel might state, "The soul is eternal," while another directly opposite asserts, "The soul is mortal and dies with the body." A third might offer a mediating position. This was not a machine built to compute a final solution, but to physically model the very process of intellectual exchange, transforming the abstract clash of ideas into a tactile, configurable landscape that a scholar could literally manipulate with their hands. Its purpose was to allow a single user or a group of debaters to map out the intricate architecture of a complex argument from all sides, seeing how each premise interconnected and where the points of irreconcilable conflict truly lay. These ingenious devices found their most important home in the vibrant, often heated atmosphere of medieval university disputations, where the goal was not to defeat an opponent but to collectively pursue a deeper understanding through rigorous dialogue. A master would present a question or quaestio, such as, "Does human free will exist within a universe governed by divine providence?" Students would then turn to the dialogue machine, physically setting the panels to represent the strongest arguments for strict determinism, perhaps aligning gears that connected divine omniscience to a fixed future. They would then carefully reconfigure the entire apparatus to build the best possible case for free will, sliding tabs to represent the human capacity for choice and moral responsibility. The machine's design forced them to engage with the full strength of each opposing view, not as a straw man to be easily knocked down, but as a coherent system of thought that had to be understood on its own terms before it could be refuted. This physical engagement with ideas cultivated a rare and essential intellectual virtue, the empathy to truly inhabit a perspective other than one's own, to feel its internal logic and appreciate its persuasive power, even if ultimately aiming to find its flaws. The ultimate brilliance of the dialogue machine was its embodiment of a core medieval conviction that truth is not a solitary monument to be discovered by a lone genius, but a living, multifaceted jewel whose full brilliance is only revealed through the respectful collision of different viewpoints. This machine made the case that the path to wisdom was inherently social and dialogical. By requiring users to physically build out an opponent's argument, it trained them in the art of charitable interpretation, the practice of presenting another's position so fairly and robustly that its own proponent would agree with the characterization. This practice was the bedrock of scholastic method, famously encapsulated in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who would begin each article of his Summa Theologica by stating the strongest possible objections to his own position before offering his reasoned response. The machine was a training ground for this exact mindset, preventing the easy dismissal of counterarguments and fostering a humble recognition that any single human perspective is necessarily partial, and that a more complete picture emerges only through the disciplined, respectful exchange of ideas. In this way, the dialogue machine stands as a powerful testament to a culture that valued intellectual humility and collaborative inquiry. It reminds us that the goal of debate in its highest form is not victory but understanding, not the silencing of opposition but the refinement of all positions through the fire of reasoned challenge. This medieval invention argues that the most dangerous intellectual error is not being wrong but being closed to new evidence, to alternative interpretations, to the possibility that even our most cherished beliefs can be sharpened and improved through encounter with a different truth. By turning dialogue into something that could be seen, touched, and manipulated, this remarkable device taught generations of thinkers that the pursuit of knowledge is a collective enterprise, a continuous conversation across time and perspective where every voice, even the most dissenting, has a crucial role to play in the unfolding human understanding of the world. Imagine a scholar's chamber where the menagerie is not of flesh and blood, but of carved wood, cast metal, and painted clay, a lion with a face of noble courage, a sly fox frozen mid-prowl, a majestic phoenix rising from its own ashes. This was the world of the symbolic Bestiary model, a device that turned the animal kingdom into a grand, three-dimensional textbook of philosophy and faith. These were not toys or mere decorations. They were sophisticated teaching tools, meticulously crafted to give tangible form to the most abstract qualities of the soul and the cosmos. Drawing from the rich tradition of illuminated Bestiary's manuscripts that described animals both real and mythical alongside their spiritual meanings, these models allowed a master to literally place a symbol in a student's hands, transforming a lesson from a lecture into an encounter with an idea made manifest. Each creature in this philosophical zoo was a key to a different moral or metaphysical lesson. The lion, often depicted courageously facing down hunters, was not just a wild animal but an emblem of Christ's resurrection, as medieval lore held that lion cubs were born dead and brought to life by their father's breath on the third day. A teacher could hold the model of a lion and use it to launch a discussion on the nature of spiritual courage and the triumph of life over death. The crafty fox, with its sly expression, became a walking lesson on the perils of deceit and hypocrisy. Even the lowly ant, modeled carrying a grain many times its size, was a testament to the virtues of diligence, foresight, and communal cooperation. This practice of layering natural observation with spiritual allegory allowed for a multi-layered education. A single model could be used to discuss the animal's actual habits as they were understood at the time, its symbolic meaning, and the higher cosmic truth it was believed to represent, creating a seamless blend of natural science, ethics, and theology. The true power of these models lay in their ability to make complex lessons unforgettable. It's one thing to be told not to be prideful. It's another to be handed a model of a proud peacock with its magnificent tail, and to hear how its beautiful feathers were also believed to hide its ugly feet, a perfect allegory for the vanity that masks inner flaws. This engagement of multiple senses, seeing the form, feeling its weight, tracing its details, created powerful memory anchors. The image of the animal and its associated virtue or vice became fused in the mind, making the lesson far more durable than any abstract maxim could. This method demonstrated a deep, intuitive understanding of how people learn best, through stories, through images, and through objects that engage our curiosity and emotion, not just our intellect. Ultimately, these intricate models reveal a defining characteristic of the medieval worldview, a profound belief that the entire natural world was a divinely authored book, filled with signs and symbols waiting to be read by the discerning eye. A roaring lion, a soaring eagle, a patient ox, these were not just biological entities going about their lives. They were living parables, each a unique word in a sacred language written into the very fabric of creation. The symbolic Bestiary model was the key that helped scholars and students learn to read this language. It taught them to look beyond the surface of things, to seek the deeper meaning hidden within every leaf, every stone, and every creature. In a world that could often seem harsh and unpredictable, this practice offered a powerful sense of order and purpose, suggesting that every part of existence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was connected to a vast, meaningful, and intelligible whole, inviting endless exploration and wonder. Yet, even as the dialogue machine modeled the careful exchange of human ideas, another set of instruments reached for a harmony believed to be woven into the very fabric of the cosmos itself. The concept of the harmony of the spheres was an ancient and powerful idea, a grand philosophical proposition that the planets and stars in their motions generated a sublime, inaudible music, a celestial symphony of perfect mathematical ratios. But where ancient philosophers could only speak of this music metaphorically, the medieval mind, ever eager to make the abstract tangible, set out to build devices that could render this cosmic concert almost sensible. These were not instruments for performance in the earthly sense. They were philosophical engines crafted from precisely tuned strings, carefully weighted bells, or intricate clockwork with moving parts. Their purpose was to model the musical intervals, the perfect fifths, the resonant fourths, that were believed to govern the velocities and distances of the planetary spheres, translating the silent mathematics of the heavens into something a scholar could almost hear and see. Holding or observing such an instrument prompted a deep and nuanced debate that cut to the very heart of medieval natural philosophy. Was this celestial harmony a literal, physical phenomenon? Some thinkers, leaning on a more Platonic interpretation, argued that it was. They proposed that the planets, being immense physical bodies moving at tremendous speeds through the ether, must indeed produce a sound, a literal hum of the universe that was inaudible to human ears only because we had heard it from the moment of our birth and thus could not perceive its absence. The instrument, in this view, was a simulacrum, a scaled-down model that gave our limited senses a glimpse of a true physical reality. Others, following a more Aristotelian or theological path, saw the harmony as a powerful metaphor. For them, the device was not a model of a physical sound, but a brilliant analogy for the exquisite mathematical order and proportional beauty that God had built into creation. The precisely calculated intervals between the strings or bells did not represent actual notes, but the impeccable logic and divine reason that structured the cosmos, making the instrument a bridge between the observable world and the mind of its creator. This beautiful tension between the literal and the metaphorical opened up profound explorations into the relationship between mathematics, physics, and ultimate truth. By plucking a string to produce a perfect fifth and then observing a corresponding gear ratio that moved a model planet, a scholar was essentially conducting an experiment. They were asking if the same mathematical principles that governed something as simple and beautiful as a vibrating string could also govern the majestic motion of a planet millions of miles away. This wasn't just science, it was a form of spiritual inquiry. If the universe was indeed constructed according to these harmonious mathematical laws, what did that imply about its nature? It suggested a cosmos that was fundamentally orderly, intelligible, and beautiful, a creation that reflected the rational and artistic nature of the divine. The instrument became a key for unlocking a universe that was not chaotic or arbitrary, but one whose deepest workings could be understood through the universal language of number and ratio. In the end, the true power of the harmony of the sphere's instrument was its ability to make grand cosmic philosophy a visceral, sensory experience. It allowed a thinker to move beyond dry calculation and abstract speculation, to feel the truth of cosmic order in the resonant vibration of a string and see its elegance in the turning of a calibrated wheel. It engaged not just the intellect but also the sense of wonder, providing a tangible focus for contemplating the breathtaking beauty and intricate design believed to be woven into everything from the smallest atom to the vastest galaxy. This device stands as a perfect emblem of the medieval quest to find unity in all things, to demonstrate that the principles of music, the laws of motion, and the nature of the divine were not separate threads of knowledge, but different expressions of a single, glorious, and harmonious pattern. Now we arrive at perhaps the most personally empowering of all these intellectual tools, a device that turned the very architecture of the mind into a landscape one could explore, organize, and command the mind palace model. Picture a scholar standing before a large, detailed diagram of a magnificent cathedral, a sprawling royal palace, or even the familiar streets of their own hometown. But this is not a map for navigation. It is a blueprint for the most ambitious construction project imaginable, the building of a vast internal library of the mind. This diagram, or sometimes an intricate three-dimensional model, served as the master plan for a memory palace, a mental edifice where knowledge was not stored as dry facts, but was instead transformed into vivid, unforgettable images and placed in specific, unchanging locations within an imagined space. To memorize an entire philosophical treatise or a lengthy sacred text, the user would take a mental walk through their personalized palace, depositing each idea as a striking symbolic image in a particular room, on a specific piece of furniture, or even in the hand of a statue. A complex theological concept about grace might become a vision of a golden fountain bubbling in the courtyard, while a logical sequence from Aristotle could be represented by a series of animated tools working in the blacksmith's forge. This was memorization revolutionized, transformed from rote, tedious repetition into a dynamic, creative, and deeply philosophical art form. The true genius of this technique, known as the method of loci or the art of memory, was its profound understanding of how human cognition actually works. Medieval scholars reviving this classical practice intuitively grasped what modern neuroscience would later confirm. Our brains are spectacularly good at remembering places and images, but notoriously bad at retaining abstract, disembodied lists of information. The Mind Palace model leveraged this natural strength. By associating a piece of information with a specific location and a bizarre, emotionally charged image, the memory was given two powerful anchors instead of one. To recall the information, the user simply retraced their steps through the palace in their mind's eye, seeing each image and decoding its meaning. The spatial sequence of the journey provided the order for the argument, and the vividness of the images ensured the details were unforgettable. This wasn't just a trick, it was a sophisticated cognitive technology that effectively expanded the natural capacity of human memory, allowing a single individual to hold entire libraries of complex material in their head, perfectly organized and instantly accessible. For a medieval scholar like Thomas Aquinas, who was tasked with mastering and synthesizing mountains of scripture, commentary, and classical philosophy, this device was nothing short of indispensable. His ability to construct elaborate mental architectures is legendary. It's said he could mentally compartmentalize different arguments so effectively that if a scribe dropped his papers during dictation, Aquinas could simply pause and then resume from the exact same point in a completely different train of thought, his mental filing system allowing him to hold multiple complex threads at once. Without losing his place, this practice transformed the mind from a passive receptacle into an active, creative workshop. Building a memory palace was an exercise in imaginative power. It required the user to deeply understand the material they wished to memorize in order to distill it into an effective, symbolic image. This process of encoding, of deciding that this particular virtue will be represented by a specific stained glass window, and that particular heresy by a grotesque gargoyle lurking in a shadowy corner, forced an engagement with the material that was far deeper than simple reading. It was a form of intellectual digestion, where knowledge was broken down and reconstituted into a form the mind could truly own and manipulate. Ultimately, the Mind Palace was more than a mere study aid. It was a profound philosophical statement about the very nature of knowledge and the self. By constructing these elaborate mental architectures, medieval thinkers were externalizing their own cognitive processes, creating a tangible metaphor for the architecture of thought itself. The palace, with its grand halls, quiet chapels, and bustling courtyards, became a mirror for the mind, a vast, structured, and navigable space. This practice encouraged a remarkable form of self-awareness and metacognition, an understanding that the mind is not a chaotic jumble but a territory that can be mapped, organized, and mastered. It exemplified the medieval drive to use every available tool, art, architecture, imagination, and spatial reasoning, to expand the boundaries of human understanding. The Mind Palace model stands as a timeless testament to the idea that the greatest discoveries often begin not by looking outward at the stars, but by turning inward and daring to build palaces within the limitless expanse of our own minds. What's truly remarkable is that these 24 medieval inventions are not just relics of a distant past, they are the conceptual ancestors of the tools we use today to push the boundaries of knowledge. Look at any modern physics lab where scientists run complex simulations to test theories about black holes or the origins of the universe. They are using the exact same principle as the scholar turning a celestial sphere, creating a manageable model to ask unanswerable questions. The virtual reality environments used to train surgeons or help patients overcome phobias are direct descendants of the labyrinth of choice, placing individuals in immersive scenarios to safely explore consequences and build understanding. Even the interactive models in a modern science classroom, allowing students to manipulate the double helix of DNA or the structure of a molecule, owe a debt to those medieval armillary spheres and logic machines that first made the abstract tactile. This legacy shows us that the drive to build tools for the mind is a constant thread in human history, a testament to our enduring need to make the invisible visible and the unimaginable concrete. By studying these historical creations, we gain a powerful insight into a fundamental aspect of human nature. Our species has always used creativity not just to solve practical problems, but to confront the biggest, most daunting questions of existence. The same imaginative impulse that crafted a wheel of fortune to meditate on fate now fuels our development of artificial intelligence to explore the nature of consciousness itself. The drive that built memory palaces to organize knowledge is the same drive that created the internet and vast digital databases to store and connect human thought. These devices remind us that art, science, and philosophy were never meant to be separate silos of knowledge. They are a braided cord, strongest when woven together. The medieval thinker saw no contradiction in a device that was simultaneously a beautiful work of art, a precise scientific instrument, and a profound philosophical prompt. And that interdisciplinary spirit is precisely what fuels the most groundbreaking innovations of our own time. This rich tradition challenges a narrow, modern definition of innovation that values only what is immediately useful or commercially viable. It asks us to also champion pure intellectual curiosity, the kind of wonder that builds a device simply to see what it might teach us about ourselves and the universe. The most profound advancements in human history rarely come from a linear path focused solely on a practical outcome. They emerge from a willingness to wander, to speculate, and to visualize the impossible. The personal computer wasn't born solely from a desire to crunch numbers faster. It grew from centuries of philosophical inquiry into logic and computation, from the same playful, speculative spirit that built those first logic machines. When we value and invest in tools designed primarily for thought and imagination, we are not indulging in a luxury. We are planting the seeds for the next great leap forward, continuing a timeless human conversation that began in medieval workshops and continues in our digital ones, forever building bridges between the world of ideas and the world we can touch. From celestial spheres to logic machines, these 24 medieval devices reveal a hidden world of intellectual adventure, a vibrant testament to an era that refused to be defined by darkness or stagnation. They show us a time of brilliant, daring creativity, where the greatest minds turned their talents not toward conquest or commerce, but toward the monumental challenge of understanding the universe and our profound place within it. These were not mere tools, they were bridges built between the world of ideas and the world we can touch, transforming abstract thought into physical reality, and allowing generations to hold the cosmos in their hands, weigh virtue against vice, and walk the intricate pathways of logic and morality. This journey through history's forgotten workshops reveals that the so-called Dark Ages were in fact illuminated by a relentless and dazzling curiosity. As we reflect on these astonishing innovations, it's worth considering how we might channel their spirit into our own modern lives and challenges. We are surrounded by technology of unimaginable power, devices that connect us to the sum of human knowledge in an instant. Yet, the most valuable lesson from these medieval inventors is not about processing power, but about perspective. They remind us that the most profound tools are those that expand not just what we can do, but what we can dream. They challenge us to use our own technology not just for efficiency or entertainment, but for genuine exploration, to build our own modern-day thought experiments, to visualize the complex systems shaping our world, and to fearlessly ask the big, what-if questions that push the boundaries of understanding. If this journey through the landscape of medieval imagination has sparked your curiosity, I would love to hear which device resonated most with you. Was it the contemplative astrolabe that turned the stars into a mirror for the soul, or the intricate logic labyrinth that trained the mind to navigate complex arguments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation about history's most fascinating ideas. And if you're eager for more deep dives into the forgotten wonders and hidden innovations of the past, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next exploration. Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure. Remember, the greatest inventions are not those that simply change how we live, but those that forever change how we see.